Okay, I have just about 1 o'clock. I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I want to begin with my standard announcement is that if you are a VR counselor and you need CRC credits, your participation in this webinar today can count towards your CRC credits. If you need CRCs for today's webinar, please shoot me an email after the training at Michael, M-I-C-H-A-E-L, .klinger, K-L-I-N-G-E-R, at dars.virginia.gov, and I will be glad to get those CRCs logged in for you. Today's webinar is webinar 5 of a 6-part series, and today we're going to be talking about SSDI work incentives. And if you were with me last week, we talked about some of the work incentives that were available for people on SSI, and with the exception of maybe 2 work incentives that I'm going to talk about today, you'll see that the SSDI work incentives are very different than the SSI ones that we discussed last week. So the first work incentive that's available to SSDI beneficiaries is the trial work period, or TWP. And those of you who are listening to this probably are familiar with the TWP just because it is so common. But I wanted to include it because it is a commonly utilized work incentive, and just wanted to go over it for people that might not be as aware of it. So the trial work period applies to people who are on SSDI only. It's not an SSI work incentives, but it allows clients who are on SSDI to work for a 9-month period where during that 9-month period, there's no limit on the amount of earnings they can make. So a client could essentially be on SSDI, work for 9 months, make $1 million a month for the 9-month period, and still keep their entire SSDI benefit. So there's no limit on the amount of money that a client can make during their trial work period. And regardless of the amount of money that they make during that trial work period, they can keep their entire benefit. So the trial work period can either be 9 consecutive months all in a row, or a month can be used here and there. So in 2018, only months where a client earns more than $850 gross count towards that 9-month trial work period. So for example, let's say somebody on SSDI starts working in October, they make $900 a month. They would use 1 month of their 9-month trial work period in October. Let's say in November, their earnings go down and they only make $700 a month. That would not count towards their trial work period. So the client only uses the trial work period once they work for at least 9 months, either consecutively or non-consecutively, where they make $850 a month. And again, during that period, there's no limit on the amount of earnings that a client can have and still keep their SSDI check. Now, it's only after the person completes their trial work period that Social Security will begin to look at earnings to determine whether or not a client is still eligible for their benefits. Following the completion of the 9th month of trial work period, the client goes into the next work incentive phase called the Extended Period of Eligibility, or EPE. And the EPE always begins immediately following the month that the client completes their trial work period. And that's true whether or not the client is working at that time. So let's say, for an example, somebody completes their trial work period in October, then the EPE would begin in November, regardless of whether the client works or not. And unlike the trial work period where 1 month could be used here and there, the EPE runs for 36 consecutive months. And again, that's regardless of whether or not the client is working. So it always begins the month following the completion of the trial work period and runs for 36 consecutive months. And during the EPE, clients will not be eligible for benefits if they gross more than the SGA, the substantial gainful activity. And if you've been with me in previous webinars, we talked about how substantial gainful activity for 2018 is $1,180 a month gross pay for individuals who are not blind, or if their primary disability is blindness, the SGA is a little bit higher at $1,970. So during the EPE, if a client grosses more than their applicable SGA figure, they're not going to be eligible for their benefit check for that month. All right. However, if their benefits, their work incentives change, or if their work situation changes rather during that period, they would be eligible for benefits if they're making less than SGA. So let me give you an example of that. Say October 1st is the beginning of a person's EPE, and they make $1,200 a month in October. So because they're over the substantial gainful activity figure for the month of October, they would not be eligible for a benefit payment for that month due to their earnings. And let's say in November they work a little bit less. Maybe they're only earning $1,000 a month in November. Because that is under the SGA guideline, and because that person is still in the EPE, they would be entitled to a benefit check for that month because their earnings have fallen under SGA. And all the person has to do to get their benefits reinstated during their EPE, if their earnings fall below the SGA guideline, is report that to their local Social Security office, and then Social Security can issue them a benefit check for that month. Now, during the EPE, a client can go in and out of cash benefit status based on whatever their earnings are for the month. All right. So if a client's in his EPE, he's making over SGA, he's not entitled to any benefits, but then his earnings go below, all he needs to do is report that to Social Security and he will be entitled to his cash benefits again. There's no new application that's required or no further action that the client needs to take other than making that report. All right. Next thing I wanted to talk to you a little bit about is the grace period. And this applies following the completion of the trial work period. And so clients will continue to be eligible for their entire SSDI check for the first month that they earn over the SGA, that's the 1180 or 1970 figure, depending on whether they're blind or not. They will continue to be eligible for their SSDI payment for the first month that they earn over the SGA following completion of that trial work period, and for the next 2 months, regardless of what they earn. So the trial work period, like I just said a minute ago, lasts for 9 months. They can make any amount of money that they want to make during that 9 months. And then with the grace period that lasts for 3 months, they can still get a check. So essentially, for the first year that a client works on SSDI, they can work and earn as much money as they want without having their benefits impacted at all. All right, so the grace period just gives the client a few more months of, hold on, seems like somebody's not on mute. I'm just gonna go ahead and put everybody on mute just to cut down on some of the background noise. All right, there we go. So basically what the grace period does is just allows the client 3 more months of continuing cash eligibility for SSDI benefits regardless of their earnings. And that 3 months is used consecutively. The grace period always begins in the first month after the client completes their trial work period and earns over substantial gainful activity, and for the following 2 months after. So let me give you an example of that one. Say the client uses their final trial work period in October, all right? In November, December, they work, but they're earning under SGA. Let's say they're making $1,000 a month. Those would not be considered grace period months because they're earning under SGA and they would be entitled to a benefit check anyway. But let's say, for an example, in January of 2019, the client starts working more, their earnings go up to, let's say, $1,200 a month. That's above SGA. And so because they earned over SGA in January, that would be grace period month 1. February and March would be grace period months 2 and 3. And then in April, if they continued at that level of earnings, then the check would stop at that point. So that's how the grace period works. It always applies following the completion of the trial work period, but it doesn't start until the person's wages first go above that trial work period limit following their trial work period. So in some cases, a client could work for several years and not use their grace period if they're earning less than SGA. It just depends on how much they're earning at the time. All right. Next thing I wanted to talk to you about was impairment-related work expenses, or IRWs. And if you were with me last week when we talked about the SSI work incentives, you remember that IRWI is also an SSI work incentive. But the way that it applies in an SSDI case is a lot different than the way it applies in an SSI case. So if you were with me last week, we talked about the eligibility criteria for an IRWI. It has to be related to the client's disability. It has to be related to the client's work. It has to be an expense that the client pays for out of pocket for and not be reimbursed. And Social Security has to approve it. All right, so the criteria for what constitutes an IRWI is the same regardless of if a client is on SSI or SSDI. But the difference is that if a client is on SSDI, the way that Social Security applies the IRWI is different. So if you remember from last week, we talked about if a client is on SSI, how their cash benefit will go up 50 cents for every dollar in approved IRWIs. That differs a little bit if a client is on SSDI. In an SSDI case, rather than only half the IRWI counting in determining a client's countable income, Social Security will allow the client to deduct all of their countable earnings, not just half of them. So, for an example, if a client has transportation expenses to get to and from work, they don't drive because of their disability, they're spending $200 a month on an Uber or a bus or whatever they use, that entire $200 a month would be deducted as part of their IRWI. All right. Unlike SSI, though, where a client can use an IRWI every month to reduce their countable income, in SSDI cases, it works a little bit differently. Social Security will only look at impairment-related work expenses if a client's on SSDI if two things are true. Number one, they have to be already past their trial work period. And number two, their earnings, at least on paper, their gross earnings, have to at least look like they're earning above the SGA guideline, that 1170 or 1970 figure, depending on their disability. And the reason why Social Security does not look at IRWIs if a person is making under SGA or if they're in the trial work period is because in SSDI cases, the purpose of an IRWI is to determine whether or not the client's gross earnings constitute substantial work. And if a client's in their trial work period, they're entitled to their benefits regardless of how much they earn. And if they're making under SGA, they're going to be entitled to their cash benefits anyway. So there's no point in using an IRWI to deduct from their countable income because they are automatically eligible for benefits if they're making less than SGA. And if you remember what we talked about previously in SSDI cases, the client's going to be entitled to their entire benefit or no benefit at all, depending on their earnings. There's no gradual reduction like SSI cases. And so if a client's making under SGA, Social Security is not going to look at IRWIs because they're just going to say, oh, well, you're making under SGA and you're entitled to your benefit anyway. So it's only once trial work period is complete and once a client appears to be earning over SGA that Social Security is going to look at those. Now, the application process for an IRWI is the same as it was for an SSI recipient. If you remember from last week, if you were with me, I talked about how the client can write a letter to their local Social Security office requesting the IRWI, just documenting what their expenses are and how much they're spending. and they would attach with that letter a copy of any receipts that they have to prove that expense. And the application process for SSDI is exactly the same. If there is a WISA involved, you might remember from last week I talked about how you could use some of the work incentives budget to authorize a WISA to help a client who is on SSI apply for an IRWI. Same applies if they're on SSDI. The WISA could receive the authorization to help the client do the IRWI request, help them write the letter, help them gather up all the receipts, and then submit that to Social Security. And then the documentation to receive payment for the IRWI service would be the same as I talked about last week. So the WISA would be responsible for providing you guys as the VR counselor a copy of the letter that they received from Social Security documenting that the IRWI has been approved, or as an alternative method, they can request an updated copy of the client's BPQI, and the BPQI will show that the client was approved for the IRWI that the WISA helped them apply for. So if you're looking to have a WISA help a client apply for an IRWI, you want to make sure that when the WISA bills for that service, along with a copy of the authorization they got, you're also going to want to see a copy of the letter from Social Security or the BPQI verifying that the service has been approved. Remember that all services are outcome-based. And yeah, I don't know why that looks like the slide's a little messed up, the subsidy slide, but the last work incentive I wanted to talk to you a little bit about was a subsidy. And this only applies in SSDI cases in 99% of the time. The only time that a subsidy would apply in an SSI case is when a person first applies for SSI benefits. When a person first applies for SSI benefits, Social Security is going to look at, number one, whether they're disabled, but whether or not also their earnings constitute a substantial earnings if they're working. So at that point, a person on SSI can use a subsidy, but as a general rule, once a client on SSI becomes eligible for benefits, subsidies no longer apply. And the reason is because people on SSI can earn more than SGA and still be eligible for some SSI benefits. A little bit different in SSDI cases. So as with an IRWI, the subsidy only applies after the completion of the client's trial work period and when the client appears to be earning over SGA. So again, just like with an IRWI, if a client's in trial work period or they look like they're earning less than SGA, Social Security is not going to look at subsidies, right? Because the reason why is because Social Security uses a subsidy to determine whether or not a person's earnings or whether or not a person's gross earnings. How can I explain this? Let me try that again. I want to make sure that I explain it in a way that's easily understandable. Social Security uses subsidies to determine whether or not the gross earnings that a client might have on paper constitutes their work activity, or whether or not they have some extra help on the job that's allowing them to earn substantial wages. And it'll be more clear in a minute once I give you an example. But it applies when an employer pays an employee with a disability the same rate as their colleagues without disabilities, even if a client works at a lower productivity level. And I've given you some examples of that in the next slide. So if a client appears to be working over SGA on paper, for example, maybe looks like they gross in $1,300 a month and they wouldn't be eligible for benefits, but the only reason why they're grossing that $1,300 a month is because they have some extra help on the job. Social Security will take that into consideration when determining whether or not a client's doing the SGA, all right? And so I've given you some examples of that on the next slide, how it works. Here are some subsidy indicators, some situations that might indicate that a client's fully not earning the wage that they're being paid. So if a client works less hours than their coworkers without a disability, but the employer's paying them the same rate even though they work less, that could be an example that an employer's paying them more than what the value of their services are worth. Or if a client has less responsibility than coworkers, maybe they have the same job title as a colleague without a disability, and maybe they're making the same amount of money, but their productivity is less because of their disability. They're not capable of doing the same type of work or all the job duties that the non-disabled person does. That's an example of a possible subsidy. If a client receives supervision on the job or extra help or shadowing, or maybe they have a job coach, those could be examples that the client's fully not earning what they're being paid. So for an example, the client might be able to do the job, but the only reason why they're doing the job is because they have a job coach there. Somebody's working with them one-on-one to show them how to do the work and make sure that they're staying on task. Or maybe they have a colleague that's shadowing them, making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Those are all examples of extra help or supervision on the job that might constitute a subsidy. So if a subsidy exists, Social Security will deduct whatever they assign the value of that subsidy to be from the countable income to determine whether or not a client's working over SGA or not. All right, so I've given you an example on the next slide of how that works. So I've given you the example of John. Let's assume that John is not blind. He's grossing $12.50 per month in wages. And so generally, as a general rule, his income would be too much once he completes his trial work period to continue to be eligible for a benefit. So on paper, it looks like he's earning SGA and not entitled to his benefits anymore. So let's say he earns $10 an hour, but he also has a job coach on site for 12 hours a month. So maybe the job coach is just there to shadow him, maybe just making sure that he stays on task, that he's doing everything he's supposed to be doing, that he gets the work done in a timely manner. Social Security is going to assign a value to that job coach in determining how much of John's wages actually count. So here's how they work it. So they take John's hourly wage, which I gave you in this example is $10 an hour, times the number of hours per week the job coach is on site. And I just said for this example, he gets 3 hours of job coaching a week. And then Social Security will multiply that by 4.3 weeks in the month. And the remainder after that is 129. All right. So what Social Security will do then is take his gross income that he's earning and subtract $129 from that. That's the amount of wages that are attributed to the job coach. And the remainder is $1,121 a month. Because he has that job coach, Social Security realizes that without the presence of that job coach on site, he would not fully be able to earn that $12.50 a month that he's earning. So that's a big difference maker for this client, because on paper it looks like he's not eligible for benefits anymore. But when you factor in the value of the job coach services that he's receiving, he's actually under SGA. And at this point, with an approved subsidy, Social Security would find that he's not making under SGA, and he would be entitled to his entire SSDI benefit at that point, once they factor in that work incentive. All right, it works very much like an IRWI in the fact that the subsidy would only apply after trial work period and once a client earns substantial wages. But the difference is that with an IRWI, like I said before, the client has to pay for the IRWI out of pocket. With a subsidy, the client doesn't necessarily have to pay for the service out of pocket. Like if they're getting a job coach or something like that, that could be paid for by DARS or another agency that a client's working with. it doesn't necessarily have to be paid for by the client to count as a subsidy. So that's one of the differences there. So just like an impairment later work expense, in order for a client to request a subsidy, what they would want to do is request the subsidy in writing, and that would be sent to the client's local Social Security office. And in that letter, they should describe, why they think their wages are subsidized. So, for example, I feel like I'm not fully earning what I'm paid because I have to take frequent breaks, or I take longer breaks than my colleagues, or I don't do all the same type of work that that my colleagues do. I come in later, or I leave earlier. That sort of stuff would be considered a reason for a subsidy. And in that letter, the client should include contact information for the employer, because Social Security will most likely want to contact that employer to verify the subsidy. So like if a client said in their letter, well, my subsidy is that my employer lets me come in an hour later every day than everybody else, but I'm making the same amount, Social Security is going to want to contact that employer to verify that the client's telling the truth, and to see if the employer can put a value on that, how much Social Security should deduct from their wages. If it's an example of a job coach situation, maybe that's paid for by DARS, most of the time what will happen is Social Security will ask the counselor to provide the contact, or the client rather, to provide contact information for their VR counselor. So if you're working with a client who is in a subsidy situation, you might actually get a call from Social Security saying, well, John Smith says that DARS is paying X amount of number of hours per week of job coaching. Can you verify that? And they might ask for like a copy of the client's employment plan or some other documentation you have to show how much DARS is paid for that job coach. All right, so along with the subsidy request, either the employer or a service provider like DARS would have to verify the cost of whatever services the client's getting, depending on what their subsidy is. And like IRWE and all the other services, you as the VR counselor do have the ability to authorize a WISA to help a client apply for a subsidy. That procedure code is A3011 in AWARE. And like all the other services, the client can actually help the client write up the subsidy letter, gather up any supporting documentation that's required, whether it be a copy of the client's employment plan from DARS if job coaching is involved, or whether it be a statement from the employer verifying whatever the subsidy they're getting on the job. The WISA can help the client obtain all that information, submit it to the local Social Security office. Social Security will review it and determine whether or not it's a subsidy. All right, excuse me for one moment, I just need to take a drink. Once Social Security verifies that a client is subsidy eligible, they will determine how much of the subsidy counts in determining the client's gross wages, and if the subsidy, once it's assigned a value, is enough to reduce the client's income under the SGA figure, then Social Security will determine that the client is still eligible for benefits. And there's no time limit on using a subsidy. It's kind of like an IRWE. Once it's approved, the client can continue to use it until it expires. So for an example, say the client's subsidy is a job coach that DARS is paying for, the client can continue to deduct the cost of that job coach from their wages every month until the point comes where they're no longer receiving the job coaching services. If something were to change where maybe they're not getting a job coach anymore. At that point, it would be the client's responsibility to make contact with Social Security to inform them, hey, I'm no longer getting a subsidy on the job, and then Social Security would have to count the client's total gross wages at that point. So subsidy, can be used until the use of the work incentive expires through the expiration of the job coach or through the expiration of the supports on the job that a supervisor was providing. So, for example, let's say they were letting a client come in late and stay early, and then the supervisor decides, well, I don't want to do that anymore. I think, I feel like you should need to be here at 9 o'clock like everybody else. Then at that point, that's no longer a subsidy, and Social Security would look at all their earnings. All right. Now, if you have a WISA that's helping a client with a subsidy, as with any other service, when the WISA goes ahead to bill for the subsidy service, they have to provide you guys as the VR counselor with the documentation that the subsidy was actually approved and applied to the client's record. The client usually gets a notice from Social Security called the work review notice, and that will document that the subsidy has been approved and how much they're not counting in terms of the client's gross wages. So when WISA goes ahead to bill you guys for the subsidy services you authorize, you're going to want to make sure that you see a copy of that work review notice with their authorization before you authorize payment for that. All right. Next one is expedited reinstatement of SSDI, and this is also a shared work incentive with SSI, but it applies to clients who, let's say, have been working over SGA for several years. They're doing well. They've given up their benefits a long time ago, but something happens where their disability changes, they have an exacerbation or symptoms, and they have to stop working, or they have to reduce their hours. Expedited reinstatement is kind of a safety net to allow clients to get their cash benefits reinstated if they ever need them without having to go through the whole application process again. All right, so the way it works is that it allows clients to request reinstatement of their benefits as long as they've gotten a benefit check within the past 5 years if a client stops working or reduces their earnings below the SGA level. And the reason why the client stops working or reduces their hours has to be because of an exacerbation of symptoms of their disability or the worsening of their condition. It can't just be like, oh, well, the client's decided to quit his job and so he needs the benefits back. That wouldn't qualify for expedited reinstatement. It has to be related to the client's disability as to why they stopped working or reduced their earnings. And the impairment has to be related to or be the same as the original impairment. So let's say, for example, somebody was on benefits because of cerebral palsy. And they've been working for, let's say, 3 years over SGA, not receiving a cash benefit for quite some time. But then something happens where they have increased spasms or pain, or they go back to Social Security and say, well, I can't work anymore, or I can't work as much because my disability's really bothering me. I'm having spasms. I'm having problems getting around. I need my benefits reinstated. Because the person has been entitled to benefits within the past 60 months, they are eligible for reinstatement of SSDI benefits. All right, so as long as they've been eligible for a payment within the past 5 years, as long as their disability is the same or related to the original impairment they received benefits for, as long as they're not engaging in SGA or earning SGA at the time they apply for expedited reinstatement, they could potentially get their benefits reinstated without having to reapply. So what that would require is a client going into the Social Security office asking for a reinstatement request, and that's just a general one-page form that the client would use to explain why they can't work anymore or why they had to reduce their earnings. And then with that, the client is going to be asked to fill out what's called a continuing disability review report. And what Social Security is going to look for there is updated medical information in terms of like how the client feels like their disability is worsened to the point where they can't work or reduce their earnings. They're going to ask for some updated medical information, like have you seen any new doctors since the first time we approved you for benefits? And if so, what did they tell you? Are you on any new medications? Have you had any surgeries? Basically, have you had any medical treatment since the first time we made a determination on your case? What they're looking for is for the medical evidence to show that the client's still disabled. So the client would have to fill out the reinstatement request and the updated medical report where they provide updated evidence. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the client has to have all their medical paperwork with them. All that they would need to do on the medical report is put down the contact information for the providers they saw. Social Security will have them sign some releases, and then Social Security will help them gather up any medical evidence they don't already have. Now, reinstatement requests can take quite a while, especially if a client's still working, because they have to determine whether or not they're still engaged in SGA and that sort of thing. But what the law provides is that once a client requests reinstatement, what will happen is Social Security will issue them 6 months of provisional benefits that they can use to live on while Social Security is making a decision on their permanent reinstatement. All right, so at the end of that period, Social Security will make a decision, and they'll have to notify the client in writing whether or not their benefits are reinstated. And if not, the client has a right to appeal that decision using the same appeal guidelines that I went through a couple weeks ago in a past webinar, and I'm not going to take the time to go through all that again. If you need a refresher on that, I did record and archive all these webinars, and you can go back to listen to it later. But basically, they do have the same appeal rights if their request for reinstatement is denied. And then they can appeal it if they disagree with that decision. If the request is approved, then the person will continue to get their cash benefits all along as they did previously. And they would continue to be eligible for cash benefits every month until they go back to work and earn that substantial gainful activity figure. All right. Maybe one of the biggest benefits of expedited reinstatement, in addition to the client being able to get their cash benefit back, is that after 24 months of expedited reinstatement payments, once a client's gotten 24 payments under that provision, they're eligible for a new trial work period and a new period of extended period of eligibility. So even if a client has used those work incentives in the past, as a general rule, they're not entitled to another one. But the reason why they're entitled to it if they have 24 EXR payments is because Social Security considers that a new period of disability. They might have a different onset date, and because of that, they have a new trial work period and a new extended period of eligibility. Last thing I wanted to talk to you about was extended Medicare. And if you were with me a couple weeks ago, we talked about some of the work incentives that were available to SSI beneficiaries that would allow them to keep their Medicaid benefits, even if their cash benefits stopped. Well, there's a provision in the Social Security law that protects SSDI beneficiaries in a similar way, and it's called extended Medicare. What that does is it allows a client to keep their Medicare coverage even if their SSDI cash benefits stop. So let's say, for an example, a client is working in their trial work period, earning $1,500 a month, trial work period, grace period are over, they're over SGA, boom, cash benefits stop. Just because cash benefits stop does not mean Medicare does. They can continue to be eligible for the Medicare benefits for 93 months after they lose their cash benefits due to SGA. So basically what extended Medicare does is it allows the client to work and keep their health insurance benefits without fear of losing their benefit. Like I said last week, in a lot of cases, it's not necessarily that the client really minds giving up their cash benefit because the cash benefits are low. It's the health insurance that they're most concerned with. So extended Medicare does offer the client peace of mind in knowing that even if their cash benefits stop, they can continue to be eligible for continued Medicare for that 93-month period. This is one of the very few automatic work incentives. So unlike some of the other work incentives that a client has to request in writing that we've talked about, there's nothing that a client needs to do in order to utilize this extended Medicare coverage. It's an automatic work incentive that Social Security will put in place for them once their earnings exceed the SGA and they lose their cash benefit. All right, so the only difference is that if a client has been paying their Medicare premium out of their SSDI check, usually what happens is if a client is entitled to cash benefits, whatever the Part B premium is, this year it's $134 for most people. That's usually just deducted from the SSDI cash benefit. If the cash benefit stops, then the client will have to pay for the Medicare premium out of pocket if they want their Medicare coverage to continue. Usually what happens is the Medicare will bill a client every 3 months. Every 3 months, a client will get a bill in the mail for their Medicare premium, and then the client would be responsible for making the payment at that point in order to keep their benefits active. If a client is on the Medicare Savings Program, that's limited Medicaid coverage that pays the Medicare premium for people, or if they're on full Medicaid and the Medicare premium is paid for them, then the Medicare premium will continue to be paid for the person receiving the extended Medicare if they're eligible for it. So not all clients are going to be responsible for the Medicare premium. It just depends on their income and resources. You know, they could still be eligible for help with that premium through the Department of Social Services. All right. So that's an overview of SSDI work incentives. What I'd like to do now, I've been talking for about 45 minutes, and I have another webinar at 2 o'clock, so I can't let this go as long as some of the others, but I do have about 15 minutes to answer some questions, so I'm going to open up the chat box. And if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box as you're in listen-only mode. Just give you a few minutes to type your questions if you have any. Okay, I don't see any in the chat box, but again, as I say at the end of every webinar, if you do have a question that comes up, you can email me or call me, 824-555-9393. I'd be glad to answer any questions you have about this webinar or any of the other material that I've covered previously. Don't forget to request CRCs if you need them. Shoot me an email and I'll be glad to get those logged in for you. Next week's webinar is the final webinar in the 6-part series, and I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about achieving a better life experience for ABLE accounts and individualized development accounts, and some of the other work incentives that allow clients to build savings. It's especially important for people that are on needs-based programs like Medicaid and SSI that generally have a $2,000 resource limit. I'm going to be talking to you next week a little bit about some of the work incentives that will actually allow a client to accumulate savings without an impact on their benefits. So they might be able to maybe save more than that $2,000 resource limit and keep their benefits. Right, so that's what we'll be talking about next week as the final part of the series. And I appreciate your time and attendance and participation today, and I hope you'll be able to join me next week. Have a great rest of the day, everybody. Bye-bye.